Right.
Um, so I guess just to I guess talk about kind of what this is and what our aim is. This I believe is something we're going to do monthly moving forward. Um, every time we do this, I'll pick a topic and have probably 20 minutes worth of things to say about it. Um, but I also am hopeful that you guys can also bring some questions to the table about things that you're currently struggling with or have in the past. Because if there's whether there's 5 people on this call or there's 50 people on this call, chances are if you're having a problem or some confusion around something, um, that's confusion that half the people on the call are having. So certainly we'll have some time at the end to dig into some questions if anybody has any. I am not going to take the first one of these as an opportunity to talk about earnest money. I feel like earnest money is the thing I talk most about with people when we're in the middle of problems. But thought that talking about inspections and disclosure after inspections was a good place to start. For 2 reasons. I think we'll talk about some best practices about what to do, but I think the more important thing that we're going to talk about is how to get your clients on the same page with why the best practices are the best practices. Because I think some of the things I'm going to say are things that if you've been doing this a while, you've probably gotten pushback from your sellers on as to why that's a good idea or a bad idea. And so I want to talk through some of that stuff more so than just here's the best practices, because I think I could probably rifle through that in a couple of minutes as to what you should do. But I think the why is the more important part. So um, I'll dive right in. I'm sure you guys all know if you've ever had a deal fall apart because of an inspection, um, the reason that they usually fall apart has fairly little to do with the inspection and more to do with people just second guessing their choice because of the inspection findings, right? But I mean, I think we've all probably had the situation where we have buyers walk away from a sale because of ungrounded outlets or missing GFCIs or a front stoop that needs tuck pointing. And I don't know why a person buying a house for 2, 3, or $500,000 would erase that decision over a, I don't know, somewhere between 20 and $2,000 repair without even having a conversation with the seller about it. So, but it happens, and it usually happens just because of indecision. So, the real question is now, as the listing agent, what do we do with that? We've had conversations about how to help buyers through inspections and make sure that they're doing the right thing based on what the results are. But here, what do we do as the listing agent when an inspection happened on a Thursday and on Saturday morning we just get a release sent over to us? In that scenario, obviously, it probably has little to do with the house and more to do with the buyer changing their mind, right? There are some things though that are valuable for us to do, and again, some of this is going to kind of maybe fly in the face of what a seller might think they want to do, but almost every contract says that if a buyer is going to renegotiate or not move forward, that they're they owe the sellers the inspection reports. Obviously, if you as a listing agent don't ask for them, you may not get them. And I think a lot of people think the best answer is to stick their head in the sand and hopefully not get the inspection reports. And I'm going to argue with that and say, I think getting the inspection reports is generally valuable. Because again, most of the time people aren't backing out over real problems with the house. They're backing out over just changing their mind. And I think the best thing you can do as you go back on the market is to be completely transparent, because every buyer starts off not trusting the process and not trusting the seller. Their assumption is that people are trying to get things over on them or not fully disclose things. And when you meet that kind of attitude with full transparency, you immediately build a level of trust that makes a buyer much more comfortable with your property and with doing business with you versus some other person that they start off not trusting. So that, I guess, is first and foremost is the first conversation you have with the seller is, hey, let's get the inspection reports. Let's look at them. If there's a handful of things on there that are legitimately valuable things to repair, let's talk about those because they're going to come up again. And otherwise, let's have this inspection report so that we can share it with other people. Now, one thing that has happened over the years a ton is agents being of the opinion that if they don't open the inspection reports that they received, that somehow that means they didn't receive them. That's not true. So if you did receive them, you have an obligation to make sure the seller's aware and to disclose. Does that mean you have to share the inspection reports? No, it doesn't. Are you creating a huge problem by not sharing them? Potentially. I can think of in the last 3 years, one inspection report that a listing agent in our office got that was legitimately unreasonable. That's not the norm. Your seller might think it's unreasonable, or they might think that unreasonable inspection reports are the norm, but it's not. I mean, most of us on this call have sold houses, and we all know that inspection reports tend to look an awful lot alike. If you sell a lot of houses that are 1960s houses or 1920s houses or 1980s houses, you see a lot of the same stuff. So no one of these houses is drastically different than any other. So we know that. Our clients don't, though. But so it's important that we share with them the value in just sharing those reports, because your other choice would be to figure out in that inspection report every single item that would be like a disclosable item. And I don't see what the purpose is in having that fight versus just sharing the reports out. Now, the next choose your own adventure path here is, what do you do if you do get inspection reports that are actually inaccurate? Whether they're inaccurate just due to a mistake, or they're inaccurate because a home inspector is making assumptions that aren't true. Both of those things happen. They're not common, but both of them happen. And at that point, what I'll say is, what we have to do is create kind of the next layer of information from another professional. It can't be a seller or a listing agent saying, oh, that's not accurate, so we're just going to not disclose it. We're not going to share the report because one thing in it wasn't accurate. All that needs to be done there, if it's an electrical item, have an electrician look at it. If it's a basement item, have somebody come out and look at it. Some of it's subjective. Some of it's not just there's a problem or there's not a problem. When I think about cracks in basement walls, all you need to do is have somebody else look at it. And I get it, at times it may feel like a pain, but the other side of the coin is not disclosing things that are potentially hazardous for both you and your seller. And then you wind up in a situation where you're either in a lawsuit or a division complaint that wasn't necessary. And not to mention, what are the chances that it's not going to be discovered at the next inspection when the next person buys the house and does an inspection again? So again, if there's some inaccuracies, all you need to do is create another layer of information from another professional. Ideally, somebody more professional than a home inspector, right? So again, if it's an electrical problem, have an electrician give you something in writing. If it's a basement wall problem, have an engineer or a basement contractor give you a statement as opposed to the home inspector. I want to backtrack just a minute and again have a little more conversation about how to manipulate this with a seller. And first, I want to ask: has anybody recently had, and unmute because I have a hard time seeing hands or anything like that? Has anybody recently had a deal fall apart because of an inspection that was for pretty lame reasons, and then the inspection report was something that your seller kind of fought you on, either sharing or not sharing? Has that happened to anybody on this call in the last 12 months? 30 people. Anybody? Nobody? It's okay if it hasn't. But okay. I was hoping to be able to do some amount of dialogue with somebody who had recently gone through this with a seller. But again, I think to reiterate, the whole point of having these inspection reports and sharing them is to build trust, which is exactly what builds positive transactions. If you've got skeptical buyers, they're going to be even more skeptical when they see, oh, the house is off the market for 6 days and it came back on. I mean, every one of us has encountered the buyer that immediately their assumption is like, oh, something bad happened at the inspection. So there must be something wrong. And there's usually not anything bad happening, like we said before. So again, talking to your clients and getting them to understand. I think most of our sellers think that deals die at inspection because of real problems. And it's just not the truth. It's just not the truth. Um, I'm trying to I'm trying to think of well, I've got a story I can tell you right now that just happened. I had a guy who bought a house and we did the inspections, and it had a pretty wild like sump pump system on the outside of the house, um, with a bunch of cleanouts and new storm sewers that went into the sump pump that was outside. Um, the house was built in the 70s. Inside, there was no real evidence of any water damage, except they disclosed, I think in 2014, if I remember right, they had storm sewer backup. Um, this was in Avon Lake, where the storm and the sanitary may not have been separated yet, because that was kind of happening during that time in Avon Lake. But the storm sewer backed up, and part of the reason it backed up was because the original sump pump system they had was basically pumping water back up into the storm and out of the house, but that was all uh, that was all full. So it was just basically replenishing the water that was backing up into the house. So they put in this new system that ultimately sent the water out into the front yard, down a trench, kind of. Um, and my guy, I remember 2 houses ago that I sold for him. He had, 3 sump pumps, exterior waterproofing, interior waterproofing, and he had a house that he just couldn't keep the basement dry to save his life, no matter what. Um, so we do this inspection, and he's aware of what was on the disclosures. We saw that. And he was aware of the new sump pump, even we saw that out in the yard. But at the inspection, it wasn't really possible to get any more detail than what we already had, right? Because you can see all the stuff, but you can't see underground. You can't see behind pipes. There's only so much you can see, right? So after we were all done, he decided not to move forward, basically because of it being a house that had a bunch of, an apparatus to try and stop water from going inside. And he was so scared of that he wasn't willing to move forward. So these are the kinds of things when I say that the example of like, there was nothing wrong with that situation. Those people claimed that they hadn't had water since they had put in that outdoor sump pump with a backflow valve. And that agent, I didn't even have to ask if she wanted the inspection reports. I explained to her why my guy wasn't moving forward, and she asked for the inspection reports. And I haven't looked at the listing. I'd be curious to see though if she actually put them right in the MLS, which I think is certainly the easiest thing to do. Now I'll tell you a story about the flip side of this. Is an agent receives inspection reports, and decides that the deal dies because the buyer asked for an exorbitant amount of money. No moving forward now. Deal dies. Second go around, new buyers are aware that these inspections existed, and the seller changed the disclosures, added some things to disclose some of the specifics that were specifically mentioned when they asked for the huge reduction. And that's all that they put on. That's all they did was change the disclosures. But the buyers were aware of these inspection reports. They never asked for them. They were never offered them, but they never asked for them either. And fast forward 60 days, transaction closes, and there's literally people who are aware of the old inspection reports hunting down these new buyers, asking them if they've gotten the inspection reports, which seems crazy to me, but this is the kind of thing that'll blow up in your face if you don't just share out these inspection reports. This person that was aware of them was so dumbfounded by the fact that these people bought this house thinking there was all kinds of problems that may have been inaccurate. I don't know. It was never looked into, but that she went out of her way to go tell these buyers that these inspection reports existed, which the buyers knew, but they were never given to them. And now in that scenario, we stand in the middle of a division complaint, where it appears as though items went undisclosed because of the fact that those reports weren't provided. So there again is why I say, like, it's much harder to affect the property disclosures to try and meet the inspection report. And had they just shared out those inspection reports, they wouldn't have had to attempt to try to redisclose on the property disclosures. They could have just simply added those inspection reports and had documentation that they had been provided by email, and everybody would have been protected in that scenario. And now they're not. So I guess, long story short, share inspection reports, ask for inspection reports first, share inspection reports with new potential buyers, whether you put them in the MLS as supplements or you offer them to them and share them at the time of somebody writing an offer. I suppose depending on the situation, one of those could be the better answer. But as opposed to trying to bury your head in the sand and just not asking for them or not receiving them, so to speak. And then secondly is just make sure that sellers understand how much trust that builds and how much easier that makes building the bridge with the next buyer to be able to get the deal over the finish line. Sellers think, not disclosing things that they're unaware of somehow puts them in a better position. And then once they're aware of it, so they don't want to be aware of anything. When really all it does is make the bridge that much closer together between buyer and seller so that deals can get done. That is my short speech about this. I'm curious, does anybody have any questions around this, or thoughts about hurdles they see as the way I'm talking about it, or again, experiences they've had directly?
Andrew, it's Jeff Young.
Yeah. Hey, Jeff.
I do have a question, but before I get to it, on our team, our listing partners routinely encourage our sellers to get a pre-sale inspection and disclose that, share that in the MLS for a few reasons. One, if there's anything they want to repair, it puts them in control. They get to shop it out from a different contractor so they don't have to pay more than necessary. If they don't fix it and disclose it, buyers often think it's a lot more money, etc. But the question I have, and when we share the inspection report with potential buyers, they already know what they're going to see. They may elect not to do an inspection, or even if they have their own inspection, it should be pretty similar to what the seller's already disclosed. So I think that just justifies, in the case you're describing as a listing agent where there wasn't a pre-inspection, explaining to the seller why it's still a good idea to share that. Sure. Now, the question I have, and this may be totally ill-founded, but I'm pretty sure I've seen in inspection reports language that the inspection report is the property of the inspector and the buyer, and you don't have authorization to share that with anybody else. Have you ever run into a problem with that?
I mean, that you're absolutely right that it says that, but the buyer signed a purchase agreement that said that they agree to share it. So the buyer can share it. The buyer can share it with anybody. They're the ones that bought it from the inspector, right?
That makes sense.
And then they signed a purchase agreement that says if they renegotiate or choose not to move forward, that they owe those inspection reports to the seller.
That's correct.
So at that point, the seller, the buyer's already agreed to share their property, if you want to call the inspection report property, with the seller. Now, lots of times, agents think like, I'm not going to just share it with them because they may not want it, which is potentially true. I can say as a buyer's agent, I always, when I reach out to the listing agent on a deal that's going to die, when I reach out to them, I ask, hey, when we send over the release, do you want me to send you the inspection reports? I don't just like hit them with it. But if they want them, I'm one, we need to share them. But I think if any of us are on the other end of that phone call, in 99.9% of the cases, I would think we'd want to be saying yes to that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Anybody have anything else? I guess also, does anybody have any problems they've run into that we want to kind of like kick around or mastermind at all about that isn't necessarily related to inspections? So I think this inspection stuff is relatively straightforward. And one, I did want to make sure to get the word out that the best practice is always to share the inspection reports directly, and then kind of how to pitch that with the seller. But is there any questions around that, or like I said, anything else that you've been running into that you're just confused about or have questions about?
Andrew, say as a listing agent, you have an inspection, or either way, when can the listing agent ask for certain pages of the inspection report that cause the buyer to back out, or do they or should the listing agent ask for an entire inspection report? Can it be certain pages?
I mean, I guess, but I think that's like I feel like Art, you're like struggling to dive right in. You're struggling with the old mindset of thinking that like by knowing things that's somehow bad for your seller. So I don't want all the pages. I feel like that's always been a tactic that agents have thought that was appreciated, is I'm only going to share the 5 pages that have the repairs that my guy's concerned about that we're renegotiating over, or that they're concerned about as to why we're backing out. But again, like what's a scenario that you can think of where having that whole inspection report and sharing it out with future buyers would be real damaging?
Well, yeah, I mean, it may be that this really would come down to the seller really didn't want the buyer to know everything on the inspection report. I mean, we have a small situation where it's just minor. The sellers are going to do the repairs. I mean, GFCI, the seller just want the page for the GFCI, handrail, little things like that. But he just wanted to request.
I would just ask though, what would be the harm in knowing more? I mean, especially if it's a scenario where the expectation is whoever's going to buy this house is going to do inspections, then like where's the downside, I guess? Because I understand. I think what you're saying, it has been the like the standard thought process. And I'm just the more I've run into this, the more I feel like I don't know that that's true. Like Jeff said, I mean, there's a reason why people are doing pre-sale inspections.
Yeah, so just get an inspection report and share that, and just let the seller know up front that we'll share the entire report.
Yeah, and say like, hey, like having this document is something we should disclose, right? Because there are things in there that do need to be disclosed. Like there'll be things in that inspection report that would very specifically fall under the categories of the questions on the residential property disclosures. Right. I mean, some of it, like if it is a missing GFCI outlets outside, theoretically, that would fall under the on page, what is it, page 4, where you've got the 2 columns of all the systems, and one of the systems is electrical.
Right.
Like theoretically, I mean, it would be arguable as to whether that's disclosed, like a need to disclose item or not. But theoretically, you've now been told by somebody that this is I don't know if defective is the right word, but it's not the way it's supposed to be. But I think more often than not, what happens is buyers see those inspection reports and they think like, wow, I can't believe somebody backed out over this stuff. This is great. Like, this is a good opportunity for me.
Andrew?
Yeah.
What might help clarify this, when we are talking with a seller and we give them the property disclosures and explain this is the one document we can't help them with, they have to do it themselves. But we always tell them that if there is something that they are unsure about whether they should disclose or not, what they ought to ask themselves is, if you disclosed it, would it cause the seller to either not want to buy the house or pay less for the house? If the answer to either of those is yes, you ought to disclose it. Because if you don't, it may come back to bite you later. And from that same perspective, if your deal falls apart because of an inspection, even though it's probably just cold feet, if you share that whole inspection report, there is no way the buyer can come back after the fact and say that you failed to disclose something if you disclosed it.
Absolutely.
If you shared it.
Absolutely. That's why. So think about how much of a nightmare it would be trying to amend property disclosure. I mean, that seems crazy to me. But I think I still would argue that the better answer would be to get that report and have it to share, as opposed to tell that buyer's agent, like, just we don't need the report, don't send it, just send over the release. Because I think then what happens now is that next buyer comes along and decide, and then you say like, oh yeah, we don't have the inspection report, and that kind of just reinstills their concerns about the fact that, like, the last guy walked away because there was a problem at the inspection, and now you're not willing to tell me anything about that inspection, so it must be bad. Because that's their assumption. We got to remember, we can't think like the way we think about things. We know that people back out after inspections for no good reason most of the time, but buyers don't know that. Buyers assume there must be something bad going on. So that's the value. That's what, like, breaks that ice immediately and makes it very clear that, like, there isn't anything that bad going on. So this is great. I'm real comfortable now because trust has been built, because they were willing to share everything they had.
One of my favorite comments, when a buyer sees an inspection report and they go, oh, they didn't disclose that, but they must have known. And there's some sellers don't know anything about their house, they just live in it. But some buyers are so suspicious, they see it on the inspection report and they go, oh, the seller must have known that.
Yeah. I mean, I think every buyer comes from a place of being suspicious because you kind of have to, right? I mean, you feel like you have to protect your own interest, and like you feel like the seller does as well. And so you start off on opposite ends of the continuum. And that's where I think, like, having old inspection reports really starts to bridge that continuum gap so that you're not as far apart. So I think it's ultimately, like I said, I think it's ultimately better for everybody. And back to the fact that it protects us and our sellers from getting sued a year in, when they open up a wall and find a pipe leaking or something, and they think like that should have been known. Now, like, anything that could have been known is known. Period.
Hey, Andrew, this is Jamie Iannetta. How are you?
Hey, Jamie, I'm all right. How are you?
Good. Question about earnest money in regards to what we're talking about. So how are you explaining to buyers when you're writing the purchase agreement, and right now with multiple offers the way they are, explaining that higher earnest money is standing out, and so they're offering up larger amounts of earnest money and then asking the risk. And so how are you explaining about, if backing out for the right reasons, you likely will get your earnest money back, but of course there's always where they could hold it for 2 years, and like, what's the most concise but proper way to explain the risk of putting a large amount of earnest money up to a buyer?
Yeah. So I think you just have to basically tell them both sides of the coin. So one side of the coin is, in our offer, here's all of the contingencies we have. So for most offers, that would probably be a financing contingency and whatever inspection contingencies you named, right? So general home inspection, potentially others, radon, septic, well, whatever. And then you say, as long as we follow the contract and we do these inspections as planned, we sign a loan application when we're supposed to, and we are meeting those deadlines and doing those things, then we don't have anything to be concerned about other than the other side not doing what they're supposed to do. And understand that there is some potential risk there. If we do an inspection and you decide you're not comfortable and you want to back out, we still need to get a mutual release signed. Period. Right? I mean, and you have to make sure they understand that there's some opportunity for the other side to not do what they're supposed to do. But a seller has no real grounds in almost every case to not release earnest money after a home inspection if a buyer backs out. I get it. There's a very small amount of language in the contract that says it has, if they find, material defects or whatever, latent defects, whatever it says, that were not previously disclosed. And then what is a defect and what isn't? I mean, what I'll say is that's always in the buyer's favor, because it would be a very slippery slope trying to figure out what defects a buyer's allowed to be concerned about or not allowed to be concerned about. Now, But like you said, Jamie, the other side of that is if the seller says that's unreasonable, so I'm not agreeing to sign this release, I mean, you're in a bad spot. And we've had plenty of those this year and last year. So
Yeah.
I understand your concern, and there is real risk there. Not really risk of losing it, but risk of not getting it back for a while, for sure.
And attorney fees, which I
Well,
think
no,
that's,
I mean, you would get it back, in 2 years. I would assume that a buyer just wouldn't sue for it. You could, but if it's under, I believe 6,000. I think just about every county around us, the minimum or the maximum for a small claims court is 6,000. So obviously, if it's over 6,000, then you're getting into civil court, and probably having to have an attorney involved. If it's under that, I think if it's a really cut and dry case, there's really no reason for attorneys at small claims court for a $2,000 earnest money check. But yeah, I think it's important that they understand the worst case scenario. If we do everything right, the worst case scenario is you either have to sue for it or you have to wait 2 years to get it back.
Andrew, I'm kind of curious if a buyer terminates for cause and the seller just refuses to sign the mutual release, assuming they still want to sell the house to somebody else and it goes under contract, can that first buyer file some kind of, not lawsuit, but some kind of motion to interfere with that transaction because they still have an interest in the property? That's a legal question. I'm just kind of curious.
I don't want to go too far down that road because I'm certainly no attorney. I guess I would say that the only reason a person would want to file that would be if they wanted to buy the house still, because you'd be going through a lot of effort just to make the other person's life miserable. I guess it would depend on the size of the earnest money. If the earnest money was 50 grand, then maybe it would be worth trying to make their life miserable because that might be the quickest way to get them to sign a release.
Yeah.
So I guess it all depends on the size of the earnest money, but yeah, I mean, that's the reason why when we're on the listing side, we would prefer to always have releases signed, because there is that is a loose thread that buyer could pull in the future. So yeah, there's certainly some risk there that could be done.
Okay, thanks.
It would be a lot of screwing around to do it though. But Jamie, did I fully answer your question? I'm sure I didn't give you words that I think are going to just make it easy all the time, but
no, you did. Thank you.
Okay. But yeah, is there anybody else on this call that's had issues with getting earnest money released to a person who clearly deserves it, whether it's buyer or seller?
Hi. Yeah, I just had an issue with this. I did also talk to Andrew about this on the phone while this was happening, but basically learned a few things. Number one, if the seller does repairs for the buyer and then the buyer does back out after that, the buyer doesn't owe the seller any money for those repairs that were done. So that was a situation where the seller was super upset about replacing a Federal Pacific panel and then the buyer walking away, when really it's just added value for the house. So, it's better for the seller. But yeah, we're going through that right now. The earnest money is still in dispute. The seller will not sign the release, and the buyer just kind of has to wait it out. So, I mean, there's not much, I guess, that we can say other than you'll get it back. It just might be 2 years. Yeah,
because in your scenario, I mean, there's no way. The deal Brooke's talking about fell apart because of financing at the last minute. But I mean, the seller's not owed anything. The seller didn't make any repairs that were highly specific to this person for them, right? They made pretty normal repairs. I'd say replacing a Federal Pacific panel is something that probably comes up on the next go around for them, because I feel like that comes up, I don't know, at least half the time that you see one of those, that the buyer wants something. So yeah, I mean, they're not owed much there. Any other questions? I knew earnest money would ultimately be a hot topic. I feel like earnest money is the thing I talk about constantly with people.
So Andrew, this is Jenny Salvaggio. How are you?
I'm all right, Jenny. How are you?
I'm great. So recently I had a buyer back out about a year ago. She just got spooked. She had driven their pet at nighttime and realized she didn't like the neighborhood. So to this day, we got a year in and the earnest money is still sitting in escrow. I reached out, the property did close like 60 days after we walked away. So it's closed, it's been done. And so I reached out to the agent recently. It's like, hey, is there any way your seller would go ahead and release that earnest money? And he won't even ask his sellers to release it. Like he's like, nope, they don't want to do it. I'm like, well, did you ask him? He's like, why would I? And so I was like, well, I wonder if the title company can reach out and just ask the sellers. Maybe at this point, it's been a year, it's $1,000. They've got their money for the closing and title wouldn't go anywhere near asking. So just an
Really?
FYI. So we have to wait another year.
That's
Yeah.
interesting. Because when you and I talked about that, I thought that was like a reasonable tactic to get them to just say like, hey, we'd love to clean up our, keep our trust account as clean as we can.
Oh yeah,
And this
she
money's
wants
sitting
to.
there.
She absolutely, and
But
yeah, and he was just really unkind about the whole thing. He won't even ask his seller. So I don't know. I was pretty bummed out about that. My buyer is okay, whatever. But I just an FYI, they can hold it. They don't even have to
Yeah.
ask the sellers to release it after a year. They don't want to. So
yeah, I mean, nobody at this point, nobody has any kind of agency relationship with that person or even with that transaction at this point. So just kind of
yeah,
disappeared.
little of a bummer. So we have to wait another year. I mean, I guess the question is, and I'm assuming you didn't say they don't have to, even though it's closed, they can still hold it for a whole nother year. They don't.
Well, they
even
have
though
to hold it. The title company
Yeah.
has no choice, right? The title
Yeah.
company can only
Yeah.
do what the contract says. That's it.
Right. There you
So
go.
the contract says that they'll liquidate it 2 years from the date of deposit. So that's what'll happen. Is 2 years from the date of deposit, it'll go back to the buyer, no questions asked. Like it even says without any further notification to the seller, right in our contract anyway.
Right.
That's what'll happen.
Yep.
It's
Oh,
just
well.
that they can't
Okay.
do anything more than that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. We got anything else from anybody? Okay. I think that about wraps us up. I'm guessing these will generally go somewhere between a half hour and 45 minutes in the future, because I think in most cases, the topic that I bring to the table probably won't take more than 15 or 20 minutes to discuss unless there's lots of questions or debate around, ways to do it or how to do it or anything like that. But yeah, like I said, we will be doing these monthly, I believe. And I'll bring the first topic to the table, but certainly come to these with questions or things that you've run into, just so we've got more to talk about, because there's, with all of us on this call, there's plenty of people who are all involved in transactions every day, and we're all doing different deals, so we're all running into different things. So hopefully it can be a good place for us to learn some things, and probably also feel like we're beating our head against the wall on some things, because I feel like no matter how many earnest money conversations I have about what's fair, what's right, or who should get it or who shouldn't get it, in the end, the fact that it takes agreement from everybody turns that one into a difficult one. And I think, again, similar with inspections, because you get people all the time who want to say that things aren't reasonable, and that's fine. But if somebody else thinks it is, then it is. So that is all I've got for today. Like I said, watch out for it end of next month. Thank you guys for your time. And for those of you that had some questions, thanks for bringing those to the table, so we had some other things to talk about as well. Hopefully you guys got something out of this. If you've got other questions regarding this stuff that you're not thinking of now, that you think of later tonight or something, feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to chat with any of you guys, and help you any way I can. All right. Have a great afternoon.